Welcome to the Economy Magazine. I'm Binyamin Tjong-Alvares with the top economic reports coming up today. Stress test reveals more European banks prepared for crisis. And Britain gets a head start on IT training in schools. First, the headlines. More than 80 countries signed up to a deal which could help end banking secrecy in the global battle against tax evasion and fraud. 51 countries agreed to an automatic exchange of information between their national tax authorities from September 2017, and 30 more agreed to join in 2018. $7.4 trillion is stashed away in tax havens, depriving authorities all over the world of around $164 billion in revenue each year. But the deal leaves many loopholes, as countries can decide on a case-by-case basis which information will be automatically exchanged.
Europe has evolved, the world is connected. Communication technology means it is easier to transfer money across continents and therefore not pay taxes. That is why the automatic exchange of information is a pragmatic and effective way to deal with the problems for global governance.
The UN called on governments to deliver on their pledges in the fight against the Ebola epidemic. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, said on Wednesday, no work on earth is more important at the moment than fighting the disease. Trained medical personnel who can operate clinics, material, and money are three basic things the UN said it needs to get the crisis under control. The Ebola outbreak has killed nearly 5,000 people since March, the vast majority in West Africa.
There is a need for far more commitments and far more deliveries upon commitments in order to bend the curve.
The number of billionaires in the world has more than doubled since the global financial crisis, according to a new report by development charity Oxfam. The report said that in countries in all four corners of the globe, a wealthy minority are taking an ever-increasing share of their nation's income. At the start of 2014, Oxfam calculated that the richest 85 people on the planet owned as much as the poorest half of humanity. According to the report, a 1.5% tax on the wealth of the world's billionaires following the financial crisis could have saved 23 million lives in the poorest 49 countries by giving them cash to invest in healthcare.
So the cost of this, the risks around allowing inequality to continue in the way it is and allowing this gap to continue growing are hugely significant, and they are going to have massive political downsides as well. So if you look at the evidence in the report that we're releasing, we talk about how actually high inequality is bad for the economy.
Ukraine and Russia bargained late into the night on Wednesday regarding the renewal of gas supplies to Kiev, but failed to reach an agreement. Russian state utility Gazprom halted supplies to Ukraine in June, citing Kiev's unpaid gas bill, which Moscow says is around $4.5 billion. For months, the gas cutoff has had little impact, but pressure is mounting for a deal as temperatures start to drop below freezing. Russia provides around 1/3 of the European Union's gas, roughly half of which is pumped via Ukraine. Ukraine, in turn, relies on Russia for around 50% of its own gas, and despite storage, has a winter shortfall of up to 4 billion cubic meters. The European Central Bank said 25 of the EU's 130 top lenders failed landmark health checks at the end of 2013, but most have since repaired their finances. The following report by I24 News reporter Daniel Roth looks into the significance of this stress test.
25 European banks failed a stress test set up by the European Banking Authority in cooperation with the European Central Bank to see how prepared banks are for a future crisis. The test, using numbers up to the end of 2013, led to market positivity in many cases, as the low number of fails out of 130 total banks tested led to a bump up in investor confidence. The worst case was in Italy, where 9 banks failed the test, which only passed institutions with higher than 5.5% common equity of risk-weighted assets. But apparently 5 of those banks would have passed if numbers into 2014 were used. Indeed, one reason markets reacted well to the news is that 12 of the failing banks on the test would have passed using up-to-date numbers. And despite growing public debt and ongoing recession, the Association of Italian Banks spun the results into good news, according to Reuters.
Notwithstanding this extreme condition, which would imply a collapse of the Italian economic system, only 2 banks failed the exam.
In Greece, 3 banks posted poorly on the test, but again, given up-to-date numbers, only 1 Greek bank with a small shortfall would have failed. But there's a noticeable gap between countries with faster-paced regulatory processes and those lagging. Sweden, Norway, Poland, Hungary, Britain, and Denmark all implemented new rules much quicker, leaving them ahead of the game in most cases. While on the other side, 5 German banks would have failed the test under tighter Basel III rules, but only 1 did under current regulation. Meanwhile, French shares saw a bump of 2 to 3% after the results were released earlier this week. Investors, it seems, were confident after that country's banks did fairly well with only 1 institution failing. The stress test seems to have let some stress go.
Today we can say that after these stress tests that there are no more phantom banks in Europe. The whole of the banking sector is under control. And based on that, I think an international investor looking at the European banking sector will be reassured.
Still, despite the sigh of relief from across Europe, the number of fails goes up by 11 if taking into account those tighter Basel III banking rules, which are only going to be fully implemented in Europe by 2019.
Joining us now is Ben Maimon, Managing Director of investment management firm Clarity Capital. Mr. Maimon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So in terms of the banks, the tests, are the results positive or negative, and for whom?
Well, I would say that generally the results were positive, and I think that that's consistent with the market's view of the results, as well as the banks broadly in Europe rebounded after the results came out. The purpose, let's consider the purpose of the tests, was really to determine not only the health of the individual banks, but really of the broader system.
Right.
And so if we look at the results, we would say that no major bank was listed in the 25 that were found to be deficient, and which I think is the most important outcome with respect to the soundness of the system. Then, aside from that, the tests were really done as of the end of December 2013. So the results, therefore, were a bit backwards looking and don't reflect some of the improvements that have happened since then. So while 25 banks were found deficient as of the end of December 2013,
right.
Since then 19 billion euros of capital has been raised. It brought it down to I think 13 banks. And there's additional capital actions that will further reduce that deficit to 4 billion from 25 billion, which is really not so significant.
What exactly is the significance of this comprehensive review of the banks, and why was it done now? Why is it conducted now?
So this is the 4th review since 2009.
Right.
I think it was done at this point. There's a couple of reasons. One is I don't think that the integrity of the past tests were enough to provide confidence in the system, and in that they said banks failed, and then they continued to have to raise capital.
Right.
So, and the other thing is that in Europe there's a new banking authority, the European Banking Authority, that's taken over oversight of the banks, and that's happening this year. So what we're trying to do, I think, is establish that in fact the banking system is stable, so that it can regain the confidence of the public and investors in the system.
Okay. On the topic of confidence of the investors and the public in general, how has the public's faith in the banking system been hurt since the financial crisis? We've seen all kinds of headlines regarding litigation charges on one hand, fraudulent mortgages on the other hand. How has the public's faith really been hurt, and how can it be rectified?
Right. So I would say certainly, I think we all would know and agree that the public's faith in the banking system was shaken by the results of 2008, and the direct result of that was additional oversight and regulation that was intended to and will most likely reduce the risks to the banking system. And those include the two major ways that's done is one through the additional capital requirements and also getting rid of some businesses that are perceived to be riskier. But now, and so that will restore, I think, the public interest. But we have to consider it as well from the investor perspective. And there, it's a little bit different take in that in the past, banks were valued based on their perceived profitability and stability. But I would make the case that largely over a cycle, the way that was interpreted in the market really ignored some of these types of tail risks or large risks that we experienced in 2008. So now we look forward and we say, okay, one bank now, as a result of having to maintain higher capital or being out of some of the more profitable, maybe possibly riskier businesses, now the profitability of the banks is likely to be lower than it was in the prior cycle. Right. And if the banks were appropriately I would say they might were not appropriately valued in the past for those risks, but now certainly they're going to have a lower valuation. So we're at a point right now where we saw it today in the news also, where we have to try and evaluate and say, okay, for any given bank, when are their litigation? You brought up the issue of litigation costs. When are those litigation things going to be behind them? I suspect that's going to be soon. The bigger question relates to what's going to be the profitability of these banks going forward once they are up and running. The economy normalizes. That will take some time. And what will the profitability look like? And I would make one final point that's really what's important is that a lot of, historically, bank stocks have been dividend payers, and people are very focused that since these banks have been trying to rebuild their capital levels, the dividends have been reduced. Now, going forward, the question is, well, how much profits will they be able to generate? When will they stop having to build their capital? And really, what kind of dividend can they pay?
Right, well, I guess time will tell. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ben Maimon, Managing Director of investment management firm Clarity Capital. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. We move on now to the UK, where coding has become compulsory for children as young as 5 in primary schools, making it the first major world economy to overhaul its IT teaching and put programming at its core. More in this report.
Students playing around with computers is a common sight these days, but this is no game. These children are actually learning the basics of coding.
It's fun. And when someone says coding, you think it's like really, really, really hard. And then you should just go up to people and say, I know how to code.
This key skill is now compulsory in all schools in the United Kingdom from the age of 5. It's not just about learning lines and lines of programming text. The tools these children are using are much more user-friendly and even ties in with their other lessons.
So our Year 6 children have been learning to code using a program called Scratch, and they're designing a labyrinth for the Minotaur because they're learning about ancient Greece. So, it's fantastic. Yes, it's a bit scary for teachers because it's something that they've not done in the past. But I think what we're doing here is embracing that by doing it alongside the children. We're learning with them.
The government overhauled the computing curriculum after industry figures warned that children were not learning the skills they needed to compete in the 21st century. The hope is that these children will find jobs in the information technology sector worth £58 billion annually. The UK is predicted to have a deficit of 249,000 technology workers by 2020.
I think that everybody sees it as a challenge. And I love Barack Obama's quote about those who out-teach us today, out-compete us tomorrow. And this is a real challenge for education globally, and we just want to make sure that Britain is doing it better, or at least as well as everybody else.
Other countries are already considering similar classes. France, for example, is offering programming to primary school pupils, but as an optional extracurricular activity. Britain hopes that by making classes mandatory, they'll make sure the country doesn't become a technological dinosaur.
And Daniel Roth joins us now for a look at other relevant reports in Media Watch. Daniel, I understand you have something about Twitter.
Yeah, so TechCrunch has this interesting story that kind of fell through the cracks. Twitter is doing something that most companies online are not trying to do. They're trying to monetize non-users.
Non-users?
Non-users. So they've got about almost 300 million users that they said in third quarter that they had. These are users, active users, people who log on often.
Right.
They think that they can bump that number up to 600 million if they include people who search online for Twitter users, who come across a news feed and want to check it out on Twitter, but who aren't actually registered. So they think they can sort of funnel ads their way and essentially monetize people who have no choice in the matter, who just stumbled upon Twitter's website, which is a really interesting way to think about it. And we may see more and more of this kind of companies reaching out beyond even the people who are registered with them.
I guess you have to have some gullible users out there as well. Well, Daniel Rutt, thanks for joining us on Media Watch. That's the end of this edition on The Economy Magazine, your daily source for economic and financial reports at i24 News. I'm Binyamin Tjong-Alvares. Please send us your comments via the feedback link at the bottom of our page and continue to watch us next week.